Okay, so example 1, you're given secant of theta times the sine of theta equals tangent theta. So you can pick either side to start with. I'm going to start with this side because it looks a little bit like I can do a little bit more with that, a little more complicated than this one. So I'm going to look at this and say, what can I do? Well, I look at that and I see, well, I have a sine here. This is secant. So let's put everything in terms of sine and cosine. So we're going to change the secant of theta. I'm going to do a trig step. So the trig step is I'm going to replace the secant of theta with 1 over the cosine of theta. So every time you do a step, you have to ask yourself, is this a trig step that I'm doing? Am I replacing something, identity that's a trig identity, or am I doing algebra? So with this one, that was a trig step. I just replaced secant with 1 over cosine. So now, when I work with algebra, I'm going to say, how do I multiply those two things together? Well, when I take 1 times sine in the numerator, I get sine of theta. In the denominator, when I take cosine of theta times 1, because this was like sine over 1, I get the cosine of theta. That's an algebra step. I'm just multiplying those fractions. And now I look to see that I have sine of theta over cosine of theta. I'm going to use a trig step. I'm going to say that is equivalent to the tangent of theta. And I'm done. I got to this side. So remember, you got to start with one side. You know where you're trying to get to, but you can't work with this side over here. You only can work with this side then. I did a trig step first, then I multiplied them. That's an algebra step. And then I did a trig step to replace sine over cosine with tangent. Also notice I'm always saying theta. I'm not saying just 1 over cosine. It's 1 over the cosine of theta and the sine of theta. Okay? Now, I will always give you some hints. This hint, I said replace secant theta with 1 over the cosine. So if you got to this and you were unsure, you were stuck, I'm going to give you the hint to start on this side and replace that secant with 1 over the cosine. So the hints are kind of just how to get started for the most part. Alright, let's look at example 2. Example 2, I have this side and I have this side. So I'm going to decide where should I start. I definitely would start with this side. A lot more things are going on here, a lot more things I can probably do. So let's see, is there any algebra or trig steps I can do? Well, I see that this is cosecant. These are in terms of sine and cosine. So let's do a trig step. Let's replace that cosecant with 1 over the sine. Okay, so all I'm doing the trig step of replacing that with 1 over the sine of theta. Alright, now we're going to do some algebra. What is the sine of theta over 1, if you want to think of it like that, times its reciprocal? When I multiply that algebraically, I get 1. Okay, so all I'm doing is multiplying those together to get 1. And now I have to ask myself, what is 1 minus cosine squared? Well, that's going to be an algebra step. Remember from your trig identity, sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. If I take that identity and subtract the cosine squared on each side, this is equal to the sine squared. And so again, that's where I was trying to get to. So I did a trig step first, wrote cosecant is 1 over the sine. I multiplied those together to get 1. That's an algebra step. And then this is equivalent to sine squared. And those are my steps to get there. And again, if you get stuck, my hint was to use 1 minus cosine squared equals sine squared. So I was hoping that you probably could get to this step, get to here by using some of the identities and the algebra. And so when I said the hint, I just wanted to make sure you knew that 1 minus cosine squared is equivalent to sine squared, okay, from our trig identities that we have. So that was my hint for that one, that hopefully if you get to that step, you would know what to do. All right, example 3. Again, deciding which side to start on. This one's already in terms of sine and cosine, and it's a fraction, so there isn't a lot at that point. It looks like I know what to do with, so I'd probably start with this side. So I would probably put everything in terms of sine and cosine, and I think that was one of my first hints. So 1 over the sine of theta minus cotangent, remember, is the cosine over the sine. Okay, so that's the first thing I did. Now I see that, so that's a trig step, and now I see I'm going to use an algebra step. I have like denominators. So when I put those together, I get 1 minus the cosine over the sine. All right, now look where I'm trying to get to. That's always kind of another thing you always want to think about, is you can do your steps, you can do your trig steps, do your algebra steps. If you get stuck, because now I have sines and cosines here, and I'm trying to get to this, you do have to look ahead. You can't do the same thing to both sides, but you can look ahead where I'm trying to get to. So I'm trying to get to a fraction similar to this one, but it has a 1 plus cosine on the bottom. So I think what my hint was is I said multiply the fraction, this fraction I have here, to get a 1 plus cosine on the bottom. Let's just multiply by 1 plus the cosine over itself. And the only reason I would know to do that is because I'm looking ahead, and that's what I want to get on the bottom. So why not multiply by it? But if I do that to the denominator, I have to do it to the numerator. So in the numerator, we have to distribute. We're going to get 1. They're conjugates of each other, so the middle term will drop out. 1 minus cosine squared. In the denominator, I have sine of theta and 1 plus cosine theta. I'm not going to distribute that one because remember, eventually I want to get this 1 plus cosine. All right, now what? Okay, so we did a little algebra there, looking ahead of where we want to get to. Now I see that I have 1 minus cosine squared. Oh, that is a Pythagorean identity. 1 minus cosine squared is the sine squared. So I'm going to replace that. That's a trig step. I'm replacing 1 minus cosine squared with sine squared. And then I see that I have a sine squared on top and a sine in the denominator. So one of those sines will cancel out. So I'm going to be left with the sine of theta in the numerator and 1 plus the cosine of theta in the denominator. And that's where I was trying to get to, remember. Okay, so again, what did I do? I did a trig step first, wrote cosecant 1 over sine. Algebra step, I added my fractions together. At that point I was kind of stuck, so I looked at where I was trying to go to, and I decided one strategy would just be to multiply by 1 plus cosine over 1 plus cosine so that I get that into the denominator. I had to do the algebra then to FOIL that out. Difference of squares it came out to be, 1 minus cosine squared. And then I had to do a trig step. I replaced the 1 minus cosine squared with sine squared. And once I did that, one of the sines canceled to give me what I needed. Now when you're working, make sure you're working down, and then if you do run out of room, you can go across. If you're going across, make sure you put an equal sign. So work down. If you need to work across, you have to separate every step with an equal sign. If you're going to multiply by something, make sure you show me that you're multiplying by a form of 1. Alright, let's see if I can at least get you started on example 4. We can look at example 4, and I'll probably do it on the next video. So if you look at this one, you definitely probably want to start with this side because it looks like there's a lot you can do. And again, when you start to see you have two fractions that you're adding together, we're going to want to get a common denominator. So in the next video, I'll start with finding getting the common denominator of those two and putting them together to see what happens.